What dark family secret have you uncovered? Story 1. I found out that one of my aunts had an arranged marriage. She wasn't originally supposed to be in it. Her sister was. But her sister was completely against marrying the guy. And I guess my grandma decided to persuade my aunt to take her place instead. My aunt and the man got married, moved away, and had kids. They lived far from us, so I barely saw them. It wasn't until I got older that I learned he had been abusive to her. Even years after his death, she still suffered from intense mental breakdowns because of everything he had put her through. Story 2. My dad tried to run out on my mom while she was pregnant with me. He had been embezzling money from a photography club at his workplace, which was a government institution at the time. Since he was the treasurer, it was all about to come out when the club needed the funds, so he decided to cut and run. By pure accident, my mom's brother and father caught him as he was leaving the house. My grandfather, a burly Scottish coal miner, grabbed him by the throat and told him that if he ever pulled a stunt like that again, he wouldn't live to regret it. According to the story, my dad was so terrified that he wet himself right then and there. To prevent further trouble, my grandfather paid the money back to the club so no one would find out. If the truth had come to light, my dad wouldn't just have lost his job. He likely would have ended up in jail. My mom, however, never trusted him with money again. Although they had a joint bank account, she had the bank limit his access and set up a separate account to manage the bills. She also went back to work so she could always support herself, which was incredibly rare for women in that part of rural Scotland at the time. Most women were stay-at-home moms, and there was no childcare for children under 4. Since my mom was a primary school teacher, she brought me to work with her. For the first few years of my life, I slept in a basket in the stationery cupboard of her classroom. At her funeral, some of her former colleagues still recognized me and said, "Oh, it's the baby in the cupboard." Story 3. It wasn't nearly as bad as some stories, but I never met my grandfather, even though he lived only an hour away and didn't pass away until I was around 10. He and my dad didn't get along. Turns out, drunkenly beating up your own kid can lead to being cut off. But what really set him off was the fact that my sister and I existed. He was furious that there was no one to carry on the family name, since my dad was his only son. So, he refused to acknowledge us at all. That changed when my youngest brother was born. After 10 years of complete silence, my grandfather suddenly reached out to my dad, just to congratulate him. He had also disowned my 2 aunts because they dared to move out and go to college. My younger aunt once told me how much she had dreaded telling him she'd been accepted, knowing she would be kicked out immediately, just like her sister had been. Years later, though, he reconciled with her, but only because she had 2 sons and no daughters. Anyway, joke's on him. My sister and I ended up far healthier and more successful than the male cousins he considered worthy of his love and attention. Story 4. I was the family secret. My biological parents started having kids when they were teenagers. By the time my biological mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was 21, and I was their 4th child. They quickly realized they needed to get their act together. They were already struggling financially, battling drug issues and barely keeping things together. So, they made the difficult decision to put me up for adoption. I was adopted by a loving family fairly quickly, just about an hour away from the city where I was born. By pure coincidence, I ended up returning to that same city for college. During my sophomore year, I decided to seek out my biological family. That's when I learned that my biological parents had separated right after I was born. My biological mom is still in and out of jail to this day, but my biological dad turned his life around. He got clean and sober, remarried, started going to church, and built a stable career for himself. He told his new wife about me when they first met, but he never told his other children. My siblings had no idea I even existed. Thanks to the internet, I tracked down his work number and gave him a call. Later, he told me that as soon as I said, "Hi, this might be really weird," but he knew it was me. Apparently, ever since I turned 18, he and his wife had been waiting anxiously for me to resurface. They knew the day would come eventually. That evening, they sat my siblings down and told them about me. It was difficult at first, but now I'm 25, and my dad and I have a pretty solid relationship. Story 5. A couple of years ago, I found out my uncle on my father's side is a pedophile. He and his wife had been staying at my grandmother's house, taking care of her while she was going in and out of hospitals and rehab. My family and I stayed at that house with him for a year, completely unaware of who he really was. That house used to be the main spot for family gatherings. But when my uncle moved in, fewer and fewer relatives showed up. Eventually, we moved our get-togethers to my aunt's house. My uncle rarely came to those either. We already knew he wasn't allowed to keep custody of his granddaughter. He had guardianship over her at one point, but he lost it due to his alcoholism, violent tendencies, and multiple DUIs. So we just assumed that was the reason he was estranged from the family. Then the year my grandmother died, our father finally told my sister and me the real reason our uncle couldn't see his granddaughter. She had filed against him for molestation. It was a complete shock. We had lived with this man for years. We had actually liked him. But after learning the truth, it became nearly impossible to even want to be around him. Thankfully, we don't visit Arizona much anymore, so it's not really an issue. Story 6. My great-aunt and great-uncle had a baby while they were still dating. They were in love, and marriage was inevitable. But coming from a very conservative society in the Middle East back in the 1950s, they had no choice but to give the child up for adoption. Once that was done, they got married and eventually had 4 more children. That child grew up knowing the truth about his origins, but chose to keep only minimal contact with the family. To this day, he isn't invited to family events and has built a separate life with a family of his own. When my great-uncle passed away, I was told he was among the strangers who showed up at the cemetery to pay respects. None of my cousins, including myself, know what he looks like. But my dad, his siblings, and their cousins all do. Story 7. My cool uncle, the one who showed up at our house every Christmas and Thanksgiving, always friendly, always great to be around. He had a bunch of cats and dogs at his place and had been married to my aunt since just before I was born. One day, my mom and I went to visit him and my aunt at their house, and there was this girl there, around 15, just a year older than me. My mom and I were confused and asked, "Who's this?" My uncle just shrugged and said, "Well, I just found out a few days ago that I have a daughter, so I guess this is your cousin." Turns out before he and my aunt got married, my uncle had a pretty wild bachelor party, which included a hired prostitute. One thing led to another, and 15 years later, my cousin showed up looking for her father. She was incredibly sweet, and my uncle actually handled it really well. He even started paying child support to her mother, completely his idea. My aunt, surprisingly, was very forgiving about the whole thing. I've never met my cousin's mom, but at least my uncle stepped up. Story 8. Does it count as a family secret if it was a secret about me that everyone was keeping from me? I recently found out that for the last 13 years, my entire extended family believed I had been raped in my early teens. The only problem, I was never raped. It was all a figment of my mother's imagination. She took a single comment I made, twisted it in her head, and then told everyone that I had been assaulted, but that they shouldn't ask me about it because I was too traumatized to talk about it. Fast forward 13 years. I was drinking with my sisters and casually mentioned a gynecological study I had participated in during my early teens. They both immediately sighed in relief and said, "Oh, thank God you finally said something. We've been tiptoeing around this whole rape thing for over a decade." Imagine my face in that moment, realizing that my entire family had thought I was a victim of something horrific, but never once asked me about it, never did anything to support or protect me. I had to gently tell my sisters that I had never been assaulted and that they had spent over a decade walking on eggshells around me for absolutely no reason. Story 9. My uncle got his high school girlfriend pregnant, and my grandmother took her to a clinic for an abortion. She agreed to pay for it, but only if the girlfriend never told my uncle that she was terminating his child. When he eventually found out, it destroyed him, but that hardly excuses what he did next. Around the same time, my mother got pregnant by my father. My grandmother, just as discreetly, offered her the same deal, an abortion fully covered if she just let it go. My mother refused, and let's just say, she didn't hold back in telling my grandmother exactly what she thought about the offer. My uncle, still furious over what had happened to his own unborn child, found out my mother had refused. He tracked her down and punched her in the stomach for daring to take what was ripped away from him. She miscarried. I should have had an older brother, but my uncle took that from me. And yet my mother, the saint she is, forgave him. She even tried to help him get therapy. He rejected her efforts and joined the army instead. I didn't learn any of this until I was an adult, and it seriously messed with my head. My uncle and I had always been close until I came out. That's when he cut me off completely. It turns out he somehow saw me as the daughter his mother had forced his girlfriend to abort. Story 10. My family could have been worth millions. My great-grandfather built a company from the ground up called Johnson Corrugated. We made corrugated cardboard for shipping boxes. He was by all accounts a major asshole, but he built the family empire, so we still talk about him with a certain level of respect. My grandfather was supposed to inherit the company about 30 years ago, but then Uncle Randy happened. At the time, my great-grandmother was still alive and, technically, the owner of the company, but she was also blind and deaf. Uncle Randy swooped in, impersonated my grandfather, and had her unknowingly sign the entire company over to him. He then took $15 million, gave half to his son, who immediately fled to Europe after receiving death threats. And within a month of screwing over the entire family, Randy died of cancer. Nobody went to his funeral, and to this day we piss on his grave. Meanwhile, my grandfather, now 80, still can't retire because he's been fighting this in court for 20 years. He's buried in $300,000 of legal fees. Screw Randy. I found out about all of this after stumbling across a massive stack of legal documents in my grandpa's attic. As for Randy's son, we still don't know where he is. Story 11. My grandmother had a sister who died in the 1960s. She never married. She had served in the army during World War II. When my grandmother turned 100, we spent time looking through old photo albums together. She told me all kinds of stories about her life. At one point, I climbed onto a chair to grab another album for her. That's when I noticed a small book tucked away at the back of the closet. Inside, there were photos of my great-aunt in an army aircraft, what looked like a fighter plane, and a few pictures of her with other people. On one page, written in simple, delicate handwriting, were just a few words, "Yours for all eternity." My grandmother panicked the moment she saw me holding the book. She told me that nobody had ever seen it before, and that she had promised to take it to her grave. Then for the first time, she told me what she believed to be the truth. Her sister had met someone during the war. Man or woman, she never knew, and that person had been killed. After that, my great-aunt had decided to never love again. I never told anyone about the book until a few weeks ago. My father asked if there was anything from my grandmother's house that I had wanted. The book was gone. When the house was cleared out, nobody had realized its importance. Honestly, I think my grandmother would have been happy about that. She died at 102, having lived through 2 world wars. She's my hero. Story 12. I was always told that my dad left me when I was born. Technically, that was true, but I later found out that everything else I had been told about him was a lie. I first got suspicious when my cousin, who apparently didn't know the cover story, casually mentioned that my dad had blonde hair. My mom had black hair, and that was supposedly where I got my black hair from, but everyone else had always told me that my dad had black hair too. Something didn't add up. I kept that thought in the back of my mind, but what really confirmed my suspicions was when I had to get my birth certificate to join the military. Listed under father's name was Alexander Smith, a name I had never heard before. My last name is also Smith. But my family had always told me it was just a random choice from a baby name book, which was why it was different from the rest of my families. That didn't sit right with me, so I started doing some digging. I spent the next few days researching Alexander Smith, and everything added up. He was born in Russia, had changed his name when he immigrated, and my DNA results showed I was 70% Russian, which made way more sense now. What really sold it, though, was when I found that his mother's name was Natasha Kelevich, the same name as my grandmother. I confronted my family about it, and that's when they finally told me the truth. Yes, he was my father, and here's what happened. After I was born, he made it clear that he didn't want kids. One night, when I was just a baby, he tried to smother me in my sleep. My brother and uncle caught him in the act and stopped him. He left after that, and they immediately called the police, but it didn't end there. Not long after, he came back. In the middle of the night, he set our house on fire. He killed our family dog in the process, and the fire spread to another house, killing an elderly woman. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. He later died behind bars. My family said they kept it a secret because they didn't want me to know that my biological father was a murderer, or that he had tried to kill me. They were planning to tell me through a letter once I joined the military, but I figured it out first. Story 13. My mother probably went abroad to have an abortion. When I was 3, she and my grandmother took a month-long vacation together. It was the only trip the two of them ever took alone. It was also the only time my grandmother traveled without her husband. While they were gone, my dad's parents took care of me. The day my mom returned, she handed me a pair of maracas. She and my grandmother told everyone they had been to Spain, but something was off. They never brought back any pictures. They never told any stories about their trip. My grandmother had tons of photos and anecdotes from her other travels, but for some reason, she had nothing to say about Spain. When I was around 8, I asked my mom about it. Her response? A quote from My Fair Lady. "The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain." That was it. She never showed me a passport stamp. For all I know, she never even had a passport. Years later in college, my mom claimed she had never traveled overseas. I reminded her about the trip to Spain. She just went silent, like she had been hoping I'd forgotten. Looking back, there were other hints that something wasn't right. She tried to donate the maracas a couple of times, but I insisted on keeping them. They mysteriously disappeared when I was about 10 or 11. Shortly before that, I had been playing with them, and she suddenly blurted out, "Those aren't really maracas." I asked what they actually were then, and why she had always called them maracas before. She gave a couple of evasive responses before shutting down entirely. None of it added up until decades later. I realized that her trip to Spain had taken place just before abortion was legalized where we lived. Around 30% of women in the U.S. have had an abortion. Given the timing and the secrecy, my best guess is that she and my grandmother either drove to Canada or flew to the UK and spent that month shuttling between clinics and a hotel room. At the time, my parents and I were living in a one-bedroom apartment. They probably decided they couldn't afford a second child. My dad never suspected a thing. What makes it even more interesting is that my mother has been a lifelong Republican, but she is adamantly pro-choice. She has never been the type to take an abstract stand on an issue unless she has personally experienced it, and she never let anyone question her about that trip. Honestly, I think I finally understand why. Story 14. My uncle had a child out of wedlock. When that child grew up, they discovered our grandfather and started calling him multiple times a month. Each time with some sob story, asking for money. Being the kind-hearted but unbelievably gullible man he was, my grandfather almost always gave in. Then one year, my uncle dropped off the map. No calls, no word, no one knew where he was. His family genuinely feared the worst. Then the child called. They claimed my uncle was dead and demanded their inheritance, plus whatever share he would have received from my grandparents' will. This infuriated the family. They were already grieving and now had to deal with someone demanding money. The situation escalated to the point where the child even threatened to get a lawyer to secure what they believed they were owed. And then, my uncle just showed up one day. Turns out he had run out of money, gotten into trouble with some banks, and had been town hopping to escape his debts. The lawsuit disappeared, but the damage was done. No one in my family let their kids talk to that cousin. The only time I ever met them was at my grandfather's funeral. Story 15. On my other side of the family, things were just as chaotic. When my family immigrated from the old country, prohibition had just started. Luckily for them, they already knew how to make moonshine. That's how my great-aunt became very involved in bootlegging and made a ton of money. We still have photos of her from back then, dressed in furs and fabulous clothes, looking nothing like the rest of our struggling family. She never had kids, but my grandmother had 8. To help, my great-aunt set up a significant trust fund for my mother and her siblings, meant to pay out when my grandmother passed. The problem? The oldest sibling, my uncle, was a lawyer. He was put in charge of the trust and a whole lot of other family money. Everything seemed fine. He had nice cars, took ski trips, sent his kids to expensive boarding schools. He appeared successful. Then his drinking got out of control. By the time the family started asking questions, the trust should have been worth about $1.5 million, with 5 siblings left to split it. That was serious money. But at my grandmother's funeral, tensions boiled over. A conversation about the trust fund nearly turned into a fistfight between my uncles. That's when the truth came out. My uncle hadn't been a successful lawyer. The vacations, the private schools, the luxury lifestyle, all of it had been paid for with family money. The trust fund was gone. Story 16. During World War II, my great-grandmother had an affair with the mailman while her husband was away at war. She got pregnant. To save her marriage, she decided to give the baby up for adoption before her husband returned. Somehow, she managed to keep it a secret for decades. No one found out until she was on her deathbed. That's when she finally told her 2 daughters, who had been born after the baby was given up, that they had an older brother out there somewhere. In the early 1990s, those 2 daughters hired a private investigator to track him down. When they finally found him, they waited in the parking lot outside his workplace, then approached him as he was leaving and told him, "We're your sisters." That was the first time he ever learned about them. My dad remembers going to a Christmas party with them when he was a child, but that's about it. They lost contact over time. I've never met them, but the whole story still fascinates me. Story 17. When my dad was a teenager, his best friend committed suicide right in front of him. I never understood why my dad was so against toy guns when I was a kid. One day, my neighbor gave me a cap gun he didn't want anymore, and we started playing with it outside on the porch. My dad lost it. He ran outside, grabbed the gun out of my hand, smashed it on the porch, and told me to go inside. I was scared, but more than anything, I was confused. I had no idea why he was so upset. Years later, I found out the truth. When my dad was a teenager, he had been hanging out at a friend's house with a group of people. At some point, his friend left the room, went upstairs, and came back down with his dad's gun. Without warning, he put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger right in front of everyone. When I found that out, I finally understood my dad's reaction that day. Seeing me and my friend playing with toy guns must have triggered memories of the real thing. Was his reaction excessive? Maybe. But knowing what he had witnessed, I don't blame him. Story 18. Aside from all the abuse on my mom's side, I don't know much about my dad's side, so I can't accurately comment on them. As for the secret, my mom refused to tell me anything about my dad while I was growing up. All the pictures of him vanished when I was very little, and she would only mention him if I did something she didn't like, using him as a comparison. If I asked anything, she'd get so angry. She was a volatile person, so I had to be extremely careful around her. Once I was old enough to start asking whose names were on his grave alongside his, we never went back. I knew my dad worked for an electric company, that he had been in the army at some point, and that he was scared of flying. That was it. Mom told me they had been married for 10 years and that he was 10 years older than her. Eventually, I found out I had an older half-brother. She only told me to mess with me right before important exams, hoping I wouldn't pass and move away from home. Luckily, it didn't work, and I escaped. Last year, an awesome Redditor helped me out with some information I needed. I had to find out how old my dad was when he died. The only person I could find was a man born in 1927. Way too old to be my dad. Nope, that was my dad. He died a few months before I was born, and it was now confirmed. He passed away just a few days before my mom's birthday at 61 years old. He and my mom had married 3 years before I was born, a year after his first wife died. I also found out my brother is 29 years older than me. And then I discovered I have an older sister who is 36 years older than me. She's the same age as my mom. So freaking wrong. My dad was older than my mom's parents. I'd like to give this story a happy ending, but I've been too scared to contact my relatives. I remember my brother, him screaming at my mom, beating her up, vandalizing her car. He never hurt me as far as I remember. I also recall me and his son hiding outside a room, asking each other why our parents couldn't just get along. I don't blame my brother for hating her. I don't like her much either. As for my sister, I heard she wanted to be in my life. Mom used to call her my aunt, but she was deeply religious, and Mom cut her off. I know where my brother lives. I found his son online. I even found my sister's church. But I've been too much of a coward to reach out. Mom always told me they didn't want me, and I'm inclined to believe her. Her relatives made sure I knew I wasn't wanted, and she made sure I knew she didn't want me either. I don't expect them to be any different. Story 19. I found out that my family was involved in some really bad stuff connected to Mexican gangs. Things like distribution and even some deaths. I discovered this when my brother's dad was found dead the day he got out of prison. My mom was talking to my aunt about it. They were speaking in Spanish, thinking I wouldn't understand, but they didn't know I had been learning the language. Growing up, my siblings and I never learned Spanish, so whenever the adults didn't want us to pick up on something, they would switch to it. But that time, I understood them. After that, my uncle went to where the incident took place. About a month or so later, a couple of people our family knew either went missing or were found dead. Later, I asked my mom about it, and she admitted that our family had been involved in this shady stuff long before my grandmother even migrated from Mexico. It finally made sense. Why we moved every 3 to 6 months. Why my uncle and grandma commanded so much respect from strangers I'd never seen before. Why we got so many freebies from people. People knew me before I had ever even heard of them. Me and my siblings aren't involved, but 4 of my cousins are. Story 20. My grandfather was actually my great-uncle, and my great-uncle was my real grandfather. To make this less confusing, let's say there were 2 brothers, John and Harry. John had a good job in America and was back visiting the old country. Both brothers attended a football match and met my grandmother, Rose. Rose was really into Harry, but John was the one with the stable job in America. So when John asked her to marry him and move to Boston, she agreed. John and my grandmother got married, and she had 3 of his children. Their marriage turned out to be less than great. Go figure. And after 10 years of no children, Harry moved to America and started living with them. Then suddenly my grandmother was pregnant with my father. Fast forward many years later, and during a drunken confession, Rose admitted to someone that she really loved my father's real dad. John always treated my father poorly, and eventually we put the pieces together. By that point, it was pretty clear that John and Rose weren't sleeping together anymore, so he definitely knew my father wasn't his. But being a good Catholic, he just put up with it. So there's my family's Jerry Springer level secret. Story 21. I was always told my dad was a mild-mannered internet entrepreneur, and that my grandfather was a happy-go-lucky retired used car salesman. I had never in my entire life seen my dad even raise his voice, and to this day, my grandfather is the nicest, sweetest, most thoughtful man I've ever met. I was in my early 20s when I found out the truth. My dad got arrested 2 states away, trying to complete a 6-figure drug deal. I met my grandpa for lunch to try to make sense of it all, and that's when he told me everything. Turns out my dad was a big-time drug dealer with clients in 5 or 6 major cities, and he got into it using my grandfather's connections because, as it turns out, my grandpa used to break people's legs and rob stores for the Detroit Mafia in the 60s and 70s. To this day, we don't talk about it much. When my dad got out of prison, we all just pretended like nothing had happened. I only brought it up for the first time a few days before Christmas. I had just watched The Irishman and started thinking about how my grandpa had run with the Detroit Mafia at the exact same time Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. I casually mentioned the movie. My grandfather said he hadn't seen it yet. I prodded a little more. He just waved his hand dismissively and said, "I heard the same rumors everyone else heard. I guarantee the only people who know what happened are the ones who were there." And that was the end of that conversation. Story 22. My uncle was always smart, fun, and kind. I haven't seen him since I was a kid, and I always wondered why. A few years ago, he killed a woman and fled. He's missing now. According to the police, he was high and sitting in his car when it happened. The window was rolled down, and a woman, most likely a prostitute and also high, tried to get into his car through the window for some reason. He tried to drive off, but she clung to the car. I don't know exactly how she died, but I assume her hanging onto a moving car had something to do with it. It's really sad. He was a genius, a great artist, and an all-around good guy, at least from what I remember. He used to do magic tricks for me, and once gave me a small statue of a fairy and a dragon for my birthday because I had told him I liked dragons. I miss him. I hope he's okay. Story 23. I'm going to be as vague as possible due to how recent this is. One morning, a family member's house burned down, and they went missing immediately after. We didn't know if they were dead or alive. There was no sign of them, their vehicle, or their pet. The pet was assumed to have died in the fire, but the fire department told us they can usually smell when an animal burns, and they hadn't picked up that scent. A couple of days passed, and we were in full missing person mode. Family, friends, and police combed through back roads, trails, and all the usual places. Then we got a report. Someone matching their description had shown up at a charity in a nearby town with a vehicle and pet that matched the description. The person claimed they had been kicked out by a spouse and left with nothing but a bathrobe and slippers. This person had been around my entire life, and I had never seen them wear a bathrobe, not once. I didn't even know they owned one. We took a bunch of photos to the charity, and they confirmed beyond a doubt that this was the person who had been there. They also reiterated the bathrobe and spouse story. One problem, this family member was never married. Then the most damning evidence surfaced. Footage from 2 different gas station surveillance cameras showed that at 7 a.m. on the morning of the fire, they had purchased $15 worth of gas in a jerry can and a lighter. By 11 a.m., they were seen filling their vehicle's gas tank. The fire had been reported at 10 a.m. The last confirmed sighting of them was at 11 a.m. We had no leads until we got the biggest one of all. A motel in a town a couple of 100 kilometers away contacted my mother after finding a note left by a guest. This person had been staying there for 4 nights with their pet. But because road conditions were bad and they had run out of money, they were heading back home. They had left their pet behind with instructions to either call my mom or find it a good home. My friend and I floored it to the town, picked up a very confused critter, and hadn't even made it home yet when I got a call. I was driving, so my friend answered. It was the police. They told her to give me the phone. When my friend explained that I was driving, the officer simply said, "Give him the phone anyway." That was when I knew this was serious. My missing family member had been pulled over by police on the route home. We turned around and floored it again. When we caught up with them in a small town an hour from home, they were different, jumpy, shifty. Something was off. When we finally got home, things started to settle. They claimed that someone had shown up at their house, drunkenly demanded money while calling them by the wrong name, and threatened to return later. This supposedly scared them into grabbing their pet and fleeing. They even implied that whoever this was might have had something to do with the fire. That would have been almost believable, except later they admitted to the investigating officer that the entire story was fabricated. The fire marshal ruled the fire accidental. A lamp, one that had been in place for about 30 years, had somehow fallen onto the bed, shattered, and ignited the mattress. The fire destroyed the bed and most of the room. A month after the fire, this family member crashed their vehicle into a large tree and was hospitalized. Then about a month after that, they came extremely close to taking their own life. The only reason they survived was that my mom heard their strangled breathing in time to get them help. They were rushed to a local hospital and then transferred to a larger one in the next major city, where they were stabilized. It was ruled an attempted suicide. In the end, we don't say it outright, but we all seem to have come to the same subconscious conclusion. They started the fire. They likely used the jerry can and lighter, set the bed on fire, and fled with their pet, leaving behind the bathrobe and spouse story while the house burned. We have no idea why. Between the made-up story, the evidence, the conveniently saved pet, and their desperate attempt to run from everything, we're left with a lot of questions and not a single answer. Story 24. My grandmother shot and killed my grandfather. He was very abusive. The first time she saw me after I was born was in prison. She pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 5 years. No one really talks about it for obvious reasons, but I have a lot of questions. I've heard conflicting stories about the type of gun she used and how many shots were fired. The only thing everyone agrees on is that the last thing he said was, "Come off it, woman." Immediately after the shooting, she was hospitalized for a mental breakdown. Her brothers were all in the military, and at their funerals they received the 21 gun salute. Every time she shakes like a leaf with each shot. Then there's my dad's third wife. She committed suicide a few years ago. They had gotten into yet another fight, and he went to sleep at his shop at work. She kept texting him, saying she was going to kill herself. According to him, he didn't respond. We live in a small town, and word spread that my dad had killed her. At first, I defended him. My dad is an alcoholic, and their relationship was mutually abusive, filled with mental health issues. But I never thought he would kill her. Then about a year ago, he was talking to my sister about how good life with his fourth wife is. And then he said, "If I had known how good life could be, I would have killed that bitch sooner." I don't know what to think anymore. Story 25. One night, someone dropped a photo album off at my house. When I looked inside, I saw wedding photos of my mom, but she wasn't marrying my dad. She had never told me she had been married before. I didn't want to bring it up in case it was a sensitive topic, but my curiosity got the best of me. So I asked my dad. They're divorced, hoping for an answer. He told me I needed to talk to my mom about it, and then he told her I had asked. That's when I found out the truth. My mom had married a man who was a severe alcoholic. One night while drunk, he caused a fatal accident and fled the scene. He was caught, sent to prison, and their marriage was annulled. She never talked about him again. Then while researching my family tree, I found something else. My grandparents on my mother's side had a third child, one I had never heard about. He was born with severe birth defects. Back then, people didn't know how to care for babies with special needs, and in many cases, it was seen as shameful. Instead of raising him, my grandparents put him in a group home and never visited him again. He died there, alone. It's heartbreaking. Story 26. One night, while my dad was tipsy, I started asking questions about my mom. My brother and I were adopted as babies from different families, so our adoptive parents are the only ones we've ever known. Later, my mom left my dad for someone else. I wanted to know why. Turns out it had to do with drugs and money. My dad used drugs recreationally, but my mom needed them. The man she left him for was also a user, and apparently the two men were in some kind of twisted competition for her. Imagine adopting 2 kids with someone, only to leave them for another addict. Then my dad told me something even crazier. My mom had embezzled a ton of money from different places and had never been caught. She was the kind of person who could pass as a nice gal. No one ever suspected her. He also told me that she destroyed a lot of families with her manipulation. When I asked for details, he refused. He said he didn't want me to think too negatively of her. My dad is a good guy. He just got the worst possible hand in life. Story 27. When I was about 2 years old, my dad found out that my mother was cheating on him. They decided to divorce, but during the process, they still lived together because of me. Until I was 19, that was all I knew. By then, I had moved in with my grandparents because of my dad's alcoholism. One day, my grandmother and aunt showed me a letter that had arrived a couple of weeks earlier. That's how I learned I had a half-brother I had never known about. Initially, my brother and his adoptive mother had been looking for my mother, but unfortunately, she had taken her own life when I was 11. So they found me instead. I was elated. My brother is 2 years and 7 months younger than me. That meant he must have been conceived right around the time my dad found out about the affair. The real kicker: my mom had been pregnant with my brother the whole time she was living with my dad and me, and he never knew. Then one day she just told him straight up, "I'm going into labor." Talking to my dad about it was tough because it completely broke his heart. But my brother's adoptive mom ended up buying me plane tickets so I could meet their family. It was one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And he looks so much like my mom. Story 28. This goes back a while. Back in grade school, there was this one girl from Great Britain. She was very proud of her British heritage and openly supported the British crown. I remember that while we were learning about the Revolutionary War, she actually criticized the Americans. One day during science class, we were talking about her British background. Jokingly, I said that since her ancestors were British, they probably came to India, where I'm from, and did something bad to my family. For me, it was just a joke. For her, it turned out to be a little more personal. She casually mentioned that her great-uncle had been a leading general in the British Army. As we kept talking, she revealed that he had actually worked in the same district of India that my family is from. In India, a district is like an American county. And then came the real shock. She admitted that her great-uncle may have murdered people back in the early 1900s. She had taken an ancestry DNA test earlier that year and found a list of last names belonging to people her grandfather could have killed. My last name was on that list. Later that day, I went home and asked my dad if any of our family members had gone missing in the early 1900s. He had a faint memory of something his own father, who was born in the 1930s, had told him. His uncle, my dad's great-uncle, and my great-great-uncle had once traveled to the main city in our district for business and never came back. Our family had always been very hush-hush about the incident. They never talked much about it. I don't know what really happened to my great-great-uncle, but whenever I see that girl, I wonder, do we share a connection that goes back generations? Story 29. I suppose the secret is me. I'm adopted. Not a big deal. My biological mom was a middle school kid. My biological father wasn't. Catholics don't tend to go for abortion. They also don't tend to put kids up for adoption. Guess this was a special case for both. My bio mom was a child who was raped. If it were somehow possible to rewrite time, I wouldn't have blamed her for aborting me. But I'm glad I'm here. A lot of adopted people eventually go looking for their biological parents. I promised myself I would never do that. I figured it was the least I could do for her. I don't know who I look like, him or her, but I don't want to risk making her stare into the face of a horror from her past. It never really occurred to me until college that I probably have half-siblings out there. One day I was in one of the buildings on campus when I saw a girl walking toward me. She was tall, lean, and had olive skin, black hair, and a distinct nose. I felt something off about her. She looked so familiar, it actually unnerved me. She was pretty, but there was something unsettling about that observation. Something I had never felt before and have never felt since. Hours later, while I was in my apartment's bathroom, it hit me. The nose, though hers was mercifully unbroken. The height, the build. She looked like my sister. Now, I doubt she actually was my sister, but she could have easily been a relative. A cousin, maybe. My university was close to the city I was born in, and that's when it struck me like a ton of bricks. I have blood relatives out there. Lots of them. I was adopted by amazing parents and have had a good life. I'm satisfied with that. But when I think about how I got here, well, story 30. My great-grandfather was involved with a mafia group. At first, he was a terrible man. According to stories from my grandmother and great-aunt, he hurt them in ways no one should ever experience. 3 years after marrying my great-grandmother, he abandoned the family. They told me that he took his own life 6 years later. One day, while exploring my great-grandmother's house, I went up to the attic. There was a strange spot on the wall that looked like a cupboard, but it had been painted over and had no handle. I had never noticed it before, and it intrigued me. I found a crowbar in my step-great-grandfather's workroom and decided to pry it open. Inside was a dusty old book. When I opened it, I realized it was my great-grandfather's journal. What shocked me most was discovering that he had actually returned, 4 days before his supposed suicide. As I read further, I learned the truth. The mafia had killed him for causing their leader's death during a drug trafficking incident. They had staged everything to make it look like he took his own life. I never told my grandmother about what I found. After reading the rest of the journal, I placed it back inside the hidden compartment, sealed it, and left it as it was. Story 31. I found out that my mom was adopted and that her entire side of the family had kept it a secret for 60 years. It all started when I planned to surprise her with a vacation. I needed to send off her birth certificate and photos for a new passport. Then she got a phone call. Something was off about her birth certificate. Numbers had been scribbled out and rewritten, making it look suspicious. They even suspected we were trying to commit fraud. Confused, I called one of my mom's cousins and asked, "Is there something the family isn't telling us about my mom? Because her birth certificate looks altered." The response was a firm no. So I called my grandmother and asked the same question. Same denial. Then I just said it outright. "She was illegally adopted, wasn't she? You bought her, didn't you?" Silence. At first she denied it, over and over. I wasn't being rude or confrontational. I just wanted the truth. Finally, after a long pause, she admitted it. "Yeah, it's true." I asked, "Who knew?" And she said, "Everyone on your mom's side of the family." It broke my mom, but we reassured her with a simple truth. She has been your mom for 60 years. She chose you. She wanted you. Life went on. My grandmother later fell ill, and we took care of her in our home for the next 7 years. Nothing changed between us. Then my mom found her biological family, and that's when things got really strange. She had 4 brothers and a twin sister. They had grown up on the same street, attended the same school, and had even been in the same class for 11 years. They were childhood friends who had simply lost touch over time. My mom always said that people would comment on how she and her best friend looked identical, but no one ever suspected the truth, because my mom's adoptive family was Jewish and her biological siblings were Christian. Story 32. I wasn't my father's biological daughter. Turns out everyone in the family knew, except me, until just before my 18th birthday. And the way I found out was far from pleasant. My mom had finally had enough of my father's emotional and physical abuse and asked for a divorce a few weeks prior. Then a week before my birthday, what a way to enter adulthood, right? My father ambushed me with the truth. He told me I was actually the result of a mistake between my mom and another man. He said he had stepped in to be my father because he was really into my mom at the time and didn't think he could have children of his own. But he was wrong. He wasn't as into my mom as he thought, and once she had children that were biologically his, he couldn't love me the same way. Deep down, I had always suspected that he wasn't my real father, but his family adored me, and I loved them too. That was the part that hurt the most. Not losing him, but realizing I wasn't truly my grandparents' granddaughter. I cried for months over it. Eventually, I met my biological father. Unfortunately, he and the man who raised me had far too much in common for my liking. I resented him for abandoning my mom as a teenager, leaving her pregnant and alone. Now I'm pretty open about it. The hardest part was telling my cousins and siblings. But these days, I can even joke about it with my younger siblings. Life moves on. Story 33. I actually shared this story on another post earlier today, but it fits this question perfectly. When I was 18, the police showed up at my door late one night and took me to the station for questioning. I had no idea why. Once there, they kept asking me about my dad. He worked across the country and wasn't supposed to be home for a few weeks, so I guess they were trying to get whatever information they could from me in the meantime. Eventually, they told me the reason. A family member had come forward accusing my dad of harming her when she was only 5 years old, whenever she would sleep over at our house. At first, I thought, there's no way that's true. I had known him my whole life. We had always been incredibly close. But in the weeks leading up to his return, the more I thought about my childhood and my dad, the more unsettled I became. Something deep down told me it was true, but I didn't want to believe it. Even my husband was frustrated with me. He couldn't understand how I could ever think my dad was capable of something like that. My dad had always seemed like the nicest person in the world. He had done so much for us. Then my dad finally came home. The police were involved, and to everyone's shock, he proudly admitted to everything. Worse, he laughed about it. He even joked that the people he worked with knew what he had done, that it had been an open secret. Just another thing to laugh about. His reasoning? It is what it is. He actually believed that children weren't capable of feeling negative emotions, something he had told me many times in my life. To say it broke me is an understatement. It destroyed my ability to trust anyone. You can know someone your entire life and never truly see the monster hiding underneath. And then came the biggest insult of all, the so-called justice system. He was sentenced to just 9 months in jail, but for some reason, he was allowed to keep his job. He worked 3 weeks at a time, then came home and spent weekends in jail. During his sentence, they gave him a private room so he wouldn't have to interact with other inmates. No one could touch him. In the end, he barely served a month before they let him go completely free. Story 34. I believe this happened in my great or great-great-grandmother's family. There was a family with young twin girls around 5 years old. One night, as punishment, one of them was sent down to the barn for a sort of timeout. Later that evening, the parents saw the other twin in the house at different times and assumed they had seen both of their daughters. Believing they were both inside, they went to bed. The next morning, they made a horrifying discovery. They had never brought the other twin back in from the barn. She had frozen to death overnight. The father took responsibility and was sent to prison. I didn't learn about this until a year or two ago when it was casually brought up in conversation. The rest of my family had just assumed I already knew. It's heartbreaking, but it also makes me wonder, what kind of environment were these girls growing up in? That one of them would rather freeze to death than disobey her parents. That the parents didn't make sure to tuck in their 5-year-old children before bed, and that the twin inside never spoke up about her sister still being outside. Story 35. My mom's side of the family is pretty big. I have 1 uncle and 4 aunts. When I was between 14 and 16, one of my aunts, I'll call her B, and my 2 cousins distanced themselves from the rest of the family. Anytime they did interact, there were massive arguments. They especially avoided my grandfather. When I was 16, my grandfather passed away from bowel cancer, along with other complications. When his funeral came around, I was upset that B and her kids, both of whom were out of school by then, didn't attend. When I asked my mom why, she just said that B had an argument with my grandfather and was being dramatic. My dad simply said he preferred to stay out of my mom's family drama. A couple of months later, I arranged to meet up with my cousins at a park. It was great to see them again after so long, but I had to ask, why had they distanced themselves? And why didn't they come to the funeral? My oldest cousin immediately tensed up. It looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. She just said, "I'll tell you another time." About half a year later, she invited me to dinner and to see her new place. I was excited and promised myself I wouldn't bring up my grandfather or any family drama. But something felt off. The whole dinner, she looked like she was in pain or afraid of me. I couldn't tell which, but it was unsettling. Afterward, as we walked back to her place, we laughed about how much our younger siblings were alike. It felt like old times. When we got to her apartment, we sat in her room drinking tea. Then out of nowhere, she started crying. I had no idea what was going on. After a while, after I hugged her and helped her calm down, she finally told me the truth. When she was 17 and in her final year of school, she often stayed at my grandfather's apartment since it was close to her school. And one night, he tried to touch her. She ran. B picked her up. A few days later, my grandfather actually showed up at B's house. He knocked on the door and apparently tried to apologize. B didn't say a word to him. Eventually, he left. My cousin told me she had managed to move past it after a year or two. But the worst part? The entire family still defended my grandfather. Even now, after his passing, my mom has never told me because she assumes I hold my grandfather in high regard for everything he had done for the family. Hearing this shattered my trust in my parents and in most of my family. At the same time, I'm glad she told me. She said it was the first time she had spoken to anyone about it other than her sister and parents. And that just talking to me helped her a lot. Since then, she has told a few of our older cousins. I haven't told my younger sister yet. She's only 14, and she doesn't need to carry this right now. I did confront my dad, and he had the exact response my cousin said he would. He dismissed it as my cousin looking for attention and told me to talk to my mom about it. That was over a year ago. I still don't know what to do. So here I am sharing it here. It's good to talk to someone. Story 36. When my older sister was 17, she attempted to harm my grandmother, on my father's side, in her sleep. Admittedly, my grandmother wasn't the best person, but she had never done anything to my sister that would justify such an extreme act. A little background. My sister already had a history of criminal behavior. She stole frequently and was quick to get violent with other students. The incident happened after she ran away from home, which consisted of my mom, my maternal grandmother, and me. She started living with my dad, my paternal grandparents, and my grandfather. One night, she sneaked into their bedroom. She grabbed a pillow and pressed it over my grandmother's face. Fortunately, my grandfather woke up in time to stop her. He restrained her, making sure she couldn't move, while my grandmother called the police. Because she was only 17, the police couldn't do much. But she was taken to court for underage offenders, similar to the Jugendamt in Germany, and they ruled that she could no longer live in their household. So she moved back home, and that's when the real nightmare began. She started abusing me. Ever since, we've made sure to lock our bedroom doors every night. Story 37. I really hope my family never finds this. I've pieced this together from bits of information I've gathered over the years. It all started when my sister got into her first serious relationship. After high school, her boyfriend started a business. Then out of nowhere, they broke up. He immediately left the country, fleeing to Germany as if someone was chasing him. Years later, she broke up with her second boyfriend under equally strange circumstances. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the more I looked into the odd things surrounding my sister, the more disturbing the truth became. Here's the timeline. When her first boyfriend started his business, my sister bought us a Wi-Fi router and an internet connection. That wouldn't have been suspicious, except that her boyfriend had no idea that his name had been used on the contract. The bill was outrageously expensive. When he discovered the debt, he had two choices: pay it off, which he couldn't afford, or disappear. He chose the second option. He showed up at our apartment one last time, took a secondary monitor he had left there, broke up with my sister, and vanished. He deleted his social media and cut off all contact. I think he eventually managed to pay off the debt with the money he made in Germany, but it forced him to close his original business. Then our second cousin came to town and stayed with us for a few days. During that time, my sister slept with him multiple times. I even suspect she and her best friend had a three-way with him. The problem? He caught feelings. For my sister, it was just a fling. For him, it was something more. Later, my sister cut all ties with her best friend, apparently out of jealousy because she had started dating a neighbor. Shortly after, my sister made a Facebook post that looked like her account had been hacked. She announced that she was breaking up with her boyfriend due to undisclosed reasons. Here's what really happened. Our second cousin had started making trouble. He wanted to marry her. When she refused, he threatened to expose everything to the entire family. He claimed that she had made him drunk and taken advantage of him while he was unconscious. Terrified, my sister confessed everything to her boyfriend. He, in turn, threatened to call the cops on our cousin, accusing him of assault if he didn't back off. Our cousin panicked. He cut all contact and left the country, moving to England for work. Later, when my sister and her boyfriend went to college, they broke up. Officially, it was due to limited time constraints. This is the one secret that could completely destroy our family. If the truth ever got out, my sister would be completely alienated. Her second ex and our cousin have both forgiven her, but I doubt her first ex ever has. Story 38. On my grandfather's deathbed, my oldest aunt revealed a secret that only she had known, the truth about his name. See, my grandfather's name was DJ. His parents had always told him that it didn't stand for anything, that they had just liked the initials, but that was a lie. At some point, my grandfather found out the truth. His mother, my great-grandmother, had cheated on her husband while he was away on a business trip. The man she had the affair with, a traveling Cherokee salesman named David Johnson. As a way of permanently reminding his wife of her betrayal, my great-grandfather named the baby after the man she had cheated with. DJ was really David Johnson Jr. It made so much sense. My grandfather had jet black hair, while all of his siblings were blonde or brown-haired. Whenever someone pointed out, the family would make excuses. Oh, he just plays outside a lot, or it's a birthmark. After my aunt told my mom this story, she decided to ask my grandfather directly. He confirmed it. The irony: my great-grandfather still raised him as his own. He never treated him differently. He loved him, a stand-up guy, though I still don't know how to feel about him naming the child after his wife's affair partner. Story 39. I once read my sister-in-law's diary. She had written about how devastated she was when my brother cheated on her, how broken she felt when he forced her to lie to their friends and family about what had happened. She wrote about how she just wanted to disappear because he had manipulated her into allowing his mistress and their child to move into their home, while she and my brother were still raising their own two kids together. Eventually, they got divorced. They told everyone that the affair had happened during a mutual break in college, that their marriage ended because of differences in finances and her struggles with medical issues while running their shared business. But in her diary, she had written the truth, that she couldn't live with a man who would sleep with another woman in their house, then come share a bed with her like nothing had happened. I've never revealed all the details outright, but when people ask why my relationship with my brother has become strained in recent years, I've let certain things slip, just enough for people to start questioning the narrative. It's hard to accept. I used to look up to him, but he destroyed that woman's life just to satisfy his own selfish desires. She's struggling now, and worst of all, they both neglect the kids they had together. That's the part that makes it truly heartbreaking. Story 40. My grandfather was born in Lebanon and didn't move to the U.S. until the 1930s when he was in his 20s. He had two older brothers and an older sister. They were Christian. When my grandfather was around 10 years old, maybe younger, maybe older, I was never able to get the exact date, his sister secretly started seeing a Muslim man. Given the time and place, this was considered a major scandal. Somehow the secret got out. I don't know exactly how the family reacted, but it was definitely not good. In the end, she ran away to be with him. Her two oldest brothers, my grandfather's brothers, were furious, more than anyone else in the family. Even their parents, while upset, didn't react as severely as they did. Determined to bring their sister home, the brothers tracked her down. It took time, but eventually they found her. By then, she had a newborn son. What happened next is horrific. The brothers stormed into the house armed. They dragged the man outside and, in a fit of rage, one of them took the baby from their sister and killed him instantly. Then they beat the man nearly to death. As he lay on the ground, barely conscious, he cursed them, cursed their entire bloodline until the end of time. They shot him in the head. After that, I don't know what happened. My grandfather told me this story only once. He got very emotional, so I didn't press him for more details. I was only 10 or 12 at the time, and to be honest, I was terrified. Years later, my grandfather left Lebanon and moved to the U.S. He built a life for himself, met a woman of Lebanese descent, and settled into a very normal existence. This was the only time he ever mentioned having brothers. Before that, all I knew about his sister was that she was beautiful, that he had loved her deeply, and that he never forgave himself for not being able to take her with him when he left. Story 41. My grandfather on my mother's side of the family was always portrayed as this godlike figure, someone deserving of deep reverence. My mother, grandmother, and brother idolized him. He passed away when I was about 3, and for most of my life, I noticed one thing. My father hated him. And I don't mean simple dislike. If cancer hadn't taken my grandfather, my father might have at some point. That's the level of hatred he had for him. I always knew something wasn't right. My family rarely talked about their past. The only thing they consistently discussed was my grandfather, and even then, a lot of the stories didn't add up. Some contradicted each other, and there was no sign of the money or belongings we should have inherited when he passed. The truth came out when my parents were planning a particularly ugly divorce. That's when my father finally told me who my grandfather really was. He had abandoned his first wife and 15-year-old daughter so he could pursue my grandmother, who was also 15 at the time. He pretended she was his daughter until she was legally old enough to marry him. He never worked, forcing my grandmother and their kids to live in abandoned movie theaters and rundown homes, all while convincing them they were living in luxury. It only got worse. He spread vicious rumors about one of his own children, falsely claiming they had HIV/AIDS in the early 80s, when stigma around the disease was at its peak.